In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Jürgen Habermas's concept of the public sphere. First, some definitions. What do we mean by the public sphere? Is it a real thing? Or is it an actual historical reality? Or is it an ideal, a model, a normative model? By normative, here I mean an ideal that everybody should adhere to. Introducing the public sphere. So, how does public opinion shape government policy? This is one of the questions that Habermas addresses. And what does he mean by the public? What power do the public have to influence the government or government policy in democratic states? First, Habermas was trying to build on the legacy of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He was a student of Adorno. His idea explores the notion of publicness and of public formation, or the formation of public opinion. And he went back to look at historical records to provide an analysis of the emergence and demise of the bourgeois public sphere. So, was there a concept of the public under the feudal society which existed before the emergence of modern society, at least in Europe? This society was very hierarchical, with the king at the top as the absolute monarch. The only kind of public activities were those in which the king or other leading people, such as nobles, displayed their power. There was no separation between state or society, or between public and private. As society changed, however, the bourgeois public sphere emerged. How does Habermas explain this? First, he explains that there is an emerging middle class, people with economic power, such as shopkeepers, traders, merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. Public opinion as the ultimate source of sovereignty, meaning it is the place where power comes from. Habermas suggests that all members of society are equal and there are no status privileges. We shall question this later on. He suggested that members of the bourgeois met in public to discuss things rationally, and this implies that the best argument won. This discussion allowed private citizens, individuals, to reflect on common or public interests and measures to protect their public interests. What does all this mean? What it means is a new class of business people, the bourgeoisie, emerged between the previous feudal aristocracy and the lower ranks of society who had to do what they were told. This meant there was now a public who had interests, and they had to find a way to make their interests reflected in government policy. What does Habermas mean by public? Well, there are various meanings, and some of them you can see here. As we can see, we could think of different types of publics, such as the reading public or the general public, which might include everybody. What is the difference between public and private? Well, usually we think of private as things that we don't want to tell people or part of our family life. But public, we normally tend to think of something which impacts everybody. But Habermas was talking about a different concept of public, which in German is Öffentlichkeit. Please excuse my bad accent. What he means here is talking about things which impact the private individual, but things which they're able to publicize, to make public by talking about them in public. So these are things which are not hidden, but things which are talked about in public because they influence and affect the individual, but likely many other individuals were similarly affected. So they become things which impact a certain public. So the basic model is that private life and society is in one area, and the state and the rulers who make policy are in another area, and the public sphere mediates between these two spheres. So the liberal or the bourgeois public sphere, did it work? Well, Habermas said it did, but what messed it up? There were various problems. First of all, the society changed around the end of the 19th century. The unifying enemy of the bourgeois class, the aristocracy who had had power before them, was gradually defeated, and government gave way to democracy in much of Europe. This led to fragmentation and conflicts. So while the bourgeoisie took control of the state, this also meant that the state expanded, often closing down areas of the independent public sphere. At the same time, due to growing education and growing freedoms, there was a political awakening of the working class. So these are the class of people who are employed by the bourgeoisie, who started to want to take part in the public sphere themselves. This led to a competition between particular interests and common interests, and at the same time, the emergence of party politics and a party political press. Habermas suggests that this caused the end of the unified bourgeoisie public sphere, which broke into a variety of different public spheres, all of which were influenced by different media. He suggests there's a re-feudalization of the public sphere, such that it evolved into a public of organized private interests, which means people stopped thinking rationally about the common good and tried to lobby for the interests of their particular group. The politicization, the making into politics of the issues that used to be in the public sphere, meant that they were questions for party politics. Do you swing left or right? Rather than questions which people talked about rationally in the public sphere. And media, as we have seen in previous lessons, for example, under the propaganda model, has started to create the engineering of public consent for elite policy. As we have seen whilst reading Chomsky's work, advertising industry also had a huge influence on forming of public opinion. And we also have seen that the media became corporatized and controlled by large companies, who therefore represented their own interests in the media. All of this led to the breakdown of the public sphere as an effective institution. So we could distinguish the actual historical bourgeois public sphere and then its breakdown. And we could distinguish an ideal. So the ideal is a public sphere that actually works and it has a certain set of characteristics. It's universal and open to all. Anybody can join in and nobody's forced to. There's no hierarchy so that everybody can speak equally. The quality of participation was also important for Habermas, that there should be rational, critical debate rather than political argument. And the rule of law should apply. In other words, nobody should, the state especially, should force anyone to do anything. So it's about the quality of participation, the quantity of participation, and the quality of the debate in the public sphere. However, Habermas's concept of the public sphere has come up under a lot of criticism. First, people think there is an oral bias of the Frankfurt School because they are all interested in oral culture and tend to be critical of mass culture. Certainly, Habermas's model of the bourgeois public sphere was based on a public sphere in which the bourgeoisie was such a small class they could actually meet and talk about things, which is no longer possible when you broaden politics out to include everybody, and mass media becomes an important channel of communication. It was also not inclusive. The public sphere was only limited to people who had property and to men. So whole classes and whole gender was excluded, amongst very other large numbers of groups, such as workers, women, lesbians, gay men, and African Americans, in this quote by Robbins. Feminist critic Nancy Fraser um, also reinforces this argument, and her article is on the reading list. It would be very useful to read it. More recently, David Morley has criticized the public sphere. He says it takes part in a very common narrative, which is the rise and fall myth. So he says, since this is a common narrative, you know, do we have to believe it? Do we really need to demonize the mass media as the thing which broke the public sphere? And Morley suggests that beyond the public sphere, there are different types of public sphere: a masculine, white, multi-ethnic, transnational diasporic sphere. All of these ideas could be open to question. So, since we're short of time, we're going to skip this one. And we're going to ask, have a quick look. So here are some questions which you might go over from your reading. Describe the basic idea of the public sphere. Who, what, when, where, how, between what and when. Describe the liberal bourgeois public sphere. Differentiate the cultural and political public sphere, which is something I've not addressed here. And describe how the public sphere might work under the welfare state and democracy. So thinking of these, we could look at some of these maps, and I'll let you work through them yourself in your own time to have a look at some of the issues which are involved. The key point that I want to bring out is there's an ideal of the public sphere, in which there's a critical public, free media, and people have rights. There's no coercion, there's universal participation and equal participation. The question then becomes, since this is not happening in reality, is it an ideal that we should work towards? Habermas later responded to criticism and constructed a new model. In his book, which came out in, I think, the 1984, Between Facts and Norms. Habermas suggests that we need a new model, and his model looks at relationships between customers and suppliers, regulatory agencies, parliament, party politics, elections, and government, with the civil service and the judiciary in the centre. So he looks at a periphery on the outside and core model with various layers, in which on the periphery there are public interest groups, voluntary associations, churches, social movements, and the social concerns move from the outside into the center where people have power. But how does this work? Well, Habermas suggests a couple of other layers where there are professionals whose job it is to ascertain what the problems are being discussed on the outer edges of public life and bring them to the attention of those with the power to do something about them. So these people are lobbyists, advocates, experts, activists, moral entrepreneurs, intellectuals, journalists, no doubt. Right, so question, what model of government is Habermas concerned with, and is it the only one? So Habermas was talking about democracies, but I'm going to skip quickly over this and pick up on the point that for Habermas, the key point is that rational deliberation Rational argument and rational decision making is what's important to make an effective public sphere. However, Chantal Mouffe suggests that no one is that rational, and in fact, this rationality is never really going to work. Her article is amongst the reading lists, and you should download it and read it. It's very short and very useful. She discusses an agonistic public sphere. This is not antagonistic, where people fight against each other, but an agonistic one in which people show passion in voicing their differences, but it doesn't lead to antagonization. Let's compare deliberative and agonistic democracy. Mouffe suggests that we live in pluralistic societies, and there's always going to be conflict. Antagonism can never be eliminated, but the people are not uniform. We are multiple and divided. There are many different publics, as we've suggested earlier. So she suggests a distinction between they, the enemy, and adversary, meaning part of we, the part of our public that we are disagreeing with. She also makes the important point that we're never going to find a solution which makes everybody happy. It's impossible to reconcile all points of view. So we have to choose between real alternatives. And she also points out that there's never a political order without powerful ideologies at work. And the question is, whose powerful ideology are we going to settle for? Her point is that we can never avoid this, but through debate we can perhaps settle on a set of hegemonic principles which are better for the wider part of the population. Right, so the public sphere is an abstract concept, a utopia. It is essential for a more mature democracy to function legitimately. Is it functioning in America right now? Let us wonder. The public sphere is embedded in a deliberative and consensual tradition of political theory. It's more than media, but also face-to-face interaction and discussions. And although it's embedded in the historical analysis that Habermas made, his central argument is normative, which means it creates an ideal that we should all aspire to. However, it has many flaws. The real public sphere, the bourgeois public sphere, was male-dominated by the interests of the bourgeoisie, and ignored subaltern spheres. It rejects passion and emotion as a normative recourse towards rational debate, and does not acknowledge the complex nature of power or the conflictual nature of political life. Well, that brings us to a close. Please now go through the readings and bring your questions to class. Thank you.